Live from the reporting site of Developmental Psychology Center, this is DEC, the source of human lifespan education.
Good morning, Philippines! Good morning, world! It's now 7:32 in the sunny morning of November 23, 2021. We hope you're having a great day here at our virtual meet and on the real world. I am Eman Coronado, your anchor for today. This is Developmental Psychology Center, bringing you the details of the death and dying stage of human development. For the headlines, defining death, the death system and cultural context, developmental perspective on death, facing one's own death, and coping with death of someone. More details will be delivered after our educational video.
For as far back as we can trace our existence, humans have been fascinated with death and resurrection. Nearly every religion in the world has some interpretation of them, and from our earliest myths to the latest cinematic blockbusters, the dead keep coming back. But is resurrection really possible? And what is the actual difference between a living creature and a dead body anyway? To understand what death is, we need to understand what life is. One ancient theory was an idea called vitalism, which claimed that living things were unique because they were filled with a special substance or energy that was the essence of life. Whether it was called chi, lifeblood, or humors, the belief in such an essence was common throughout the world and still persists in the stories of creatures who can somehow drain life from others or some form of magical sources that can replenish it. What we now know is that life is not contained in some magical substance or spark, but within the ongoing biological processes themselves. And to understand these processes, we need to zoom down to the level of our individual cells. Inside each of these cells, chemical reactions are constantly occurring, powered by the glucose and oxygen that our bodies convert into the energy-carrying molecule known as ATP. Cells use this energy for everything from repair to growth to reproduction. Not only does it take a lot of energy to make the necessary molecules, but it takes even more to get them where they need to be. The universal phenomenon of entropy means that molecules will tend towards diffusing randomly, moving from areas of high concentration to low concentration, or even breaking apart into smaller molecules and atoms. So cells must constantly keep entropy in check by using energy to maintain their molecules in the very complicated formations necessary for biological functions to occur. The breaking down of these arrangements when the entire cell succumbs to entropy is what eventually results in death. This is the reason that organisms can't be simply sparked back to life once they've already died. We can pump air into someone's lungs, but it won't do much good if the many other processes involved in the respiratory cycle are no longer functioning. Similarly, the electric shock from a defibrillator doesn't jumpstart an inanimate heart, but resynchronizes the muscle cells in an abnormally beating heart so they regain their normal rhythm. This can prevent a person from dying, but it won't raise a dead body, or a monster sewn together from dead bodies. So it would seem that all our various medical miracles can delay or prevent death, but not reverse it.
We are now back at the Developmental Psychology Center. Chian and Lovely are ready to explain the context of defining death.
Thank you, Eman. Today, let us get to know more about what is death and decisions regarding life, death, and healthcare. In everyday language, we don't have to worry about being super specific when it comes to certain topics. But people need to be specific about ice cream because mint chocolate is very different from vanilla. But there are other topics, like the topic of that lay people don't need to be especially specific about. Every person will define that a little differently. I'm not here to change how you view the difference between life and death. This is merely presenting the different ideas, be they medical or spiritual. Unfortunately, a single definition of that is kind of a layperson thing. Instead, we are going to explore several aspects, and they are brain that, cortical that, clinical that, social that, and psychological that. The first aspect of that is brain that. When we deal about brain that, we're talking about a brain that can no longer function in its usual capacity. The brain is responsible for running the body, right? In brain dead, although we can keep the body running by artificial means, the person's mind, personality, and everything else we use to define the person by their thoughts and feelings is gone. This means they will not regain consciousness or be able to breathe without support. A person whose brain is dead is legally confirmed as dead. The second aspect of that is cortical death. Cortical death is also known as persistent or vegetative state. It is likely caused by severe brain damage or lesions. For example, the person's heart, kidneys, and lungs are functioning to some degree, but their brain is so damaged. In a vegetative state, a person may appear to wake up, but there is no consciousness there. They may smile or move slightly or talk with their eyes a bit, but that's the limit. They never speak and respond to instructions or seem to be conscious. They have survived independently of ventilators. So in cortical death, they are not gone and there has been no final goodbye yet. So the question is, as to where the coma falls under the two aspects of that, brain death or cortical death. So the answer to the question is, the coma falls under the cortical death. So here's an explanation. The brain consists of mainly two parts, the cortex and the brainstem. The cortex is higher thinking, whereas the brainstem controls the breathing and is the center of human consciousness. If one cortex is severely damaged, one become unconscious and fall into a coma. But since the brainstem controls the breathing, the comatose patient can still breathe. Although, comatose patients are sometimes attached to a ventilator to help them breathe. Sometimes, people can recover from coma. Brain death, however, is a whole different story. Brain death means the whole brain has died, both the cortex and the brainstem. Normally, if the brain dies, you cannot breathe. You can't get oxygen and all the other organs die. So to conclude, brain death is a legal definition of death with no chance of revival, while cortical death may survive for prolonged periods if provided with nutrition and fluids. Let's move on to another aspect of that, which is the clinical death. Clinical death is a term used when the blood circulation and breathing are coming to an end. It's a cessation of the heart and brain functioning. For example, in cardiac arrest, clinical death is observed. Heart is the main pumping organ of the body. It pumps the blood throughout the body, which helps in the oxygen transport to all tissues. The brain gradually ceases to function after the heart stops beating. Then after the heart stops beating, the brain remains alive for about 4 to 6 minutes. It is during the time that the right medication attention works, or the right medical attention works. The cardiopulmonary resuscitation or the CPR, defibrillation, epinephrine injection, And these are the certain techniques used to revive patients from the clinical death phase. Once that the period has passed and do not perform the right medication, the person's brain death or sure sign of death sets after clinical death. In summary, no heartbeat, no blood circulation, plus no brain activity is equal to clinical death. On the other hand, no brain activities plus no hope of recovery is the brain death. Let us now turn our attention to another facet of death, which is the social death. Social death begins much earlier than psychological death. Social death occurs when others begin to withdraw from someone who is terminally ill or has been diagnosed with a terminal illness or a disease or condition which can be cured and is likely to lead to someone's death. Those diagnosed with the conditions such as the AIDS or the cancer may find that friends, family members, and even healthcare professionals begin to say less and visit less frequently. Doctors may spend less time with patients after their prognosis becomes poor. So why do others begin to withdraw? Friends and family members may feel that they do not know what to say or that they can offer no solutions to relieve suffering. They withdraw to protect themselves against the feeling of being inadequate or from having to face the reality of that. Health professionals trained to heal may also feel inadequate and uncomfortable facing decline death. In short, someone is treated as if they were dead or non-existent. And the fifth aspect of death is psychological death. Psychological death occurs when the person begins to accept their death and to withdraw from others psychologically. They may be less interested in some normal activities, world events, and social relationships. So in summary, social death occurs when others stop visiting or calling on someone who is terminally ill or in the dying process, while the psychological death occurs when the person begins to accept their death and to withdraw from others psychologically. So decisions regarding life, death, and healthcare. If you have terminal illness or you're approaching the end of your life, it can be a good idea to record your views, preferences, and priorities about your future care. Planning ahead like this is sometimes called advanced care planning. It involves thinking and talking about your wishes for how you've cared for in the final months of your life and when you're dying. This is in case there's a time in the future when you're unable to take part in the discussions and decision making. An example of planning ahead is the RESPECT process or the summary plan for emergency care and treatment. It is where you discuss your wishes and document them. It is a summary of personalized recommendations for a person's clinical care in a future emergency in which they do not have the capacity to make or express choices. Lovely will give us additional information.
Yes, Shian. I will report about the euthanasia, types of euthanasia, what is assisted suicide, and what is the two different care for dying individuals. What is euthanasia? The word euthanasia itself comes from the Greek word eu means good and thanatos means death. The idea is that instead of condemning someone to a slow, painful, or undignified death, euthanasia would allow the patient to experience a relatively good death. Euthanasia is also called the easy death, is the act of painlessly ending the lives of individuals who are suffering from incurable disease or severe disability. A doctor is allowed by law to end a person's life by a painless means. Sometimes the patient doesn't know that he or she will die at that moment as long as the family agrees to signing of contract between the patient's doctor. There are some countries that first legalized euthanasia, were the Netherlands in 2001 and Belgium in 2002. And there are two types of euthanasia, and here are some distinctions demarcating different versions of it. The first type of euthanasia is the passive euthanasia. Passive euthanasia occurs when person is allowed to die but withholding available treatment. Passive euthanasia intentionally letting a patient die by withholding artificial life support such as a ventilator or feeding tube. Some ethicists distinguish between withholding life support and withdrawing life support. In short, the patient is on life support but then removed from it. The next type and the last type of euthanasia is the active euthanasia. Active euthanasia occurs when death is deliberately induced, as when a lethal dose of a drug is injected to a person, and it is also called the aggressive euthanasia. Next topic is about the assisted suicide. Assisted suicide requires the patient to self-administer the lethal medication, and the patient is allowed to decide where and when to do this. The patient administers the means of death but with the assistance of another person, such as a physician, and it also called the physician-assisted suicide. The phrase physician-assisted suicide refers to active voluntary assisted euthanasia, where a physician assists the patient. A physician provides the patient with the means, such as a sufficient medication for the patient to kill him or herself. And for example, the patient will sign the paper for his medication. The patient's family knows what would happen in this situation. They just have to be with the person. But before doing the procedure, the physician will give an instruction to the patient what would he do in the medication. He will assist the patient how to manipulate the machine or the tube so he can perform alone with the lethal medication. And in fact, no one would be inside the room but the patient himself. And take note, in lethal medication, the lower the LD-50 or the median lethal dose, which means the greater toxicity. The lethal dose contains the pathogens, toxins, and radiation. The next topic is needed better care for dying individuals. Dying individuals often get too little or too much care, and there are two types of care: the hospice care and the palliative care. Hospice care. Hospice care cures diseases and prolong life. Appropriate in the end of life stage, illness is no longer responding to a treatment. And who can benefit from hospice care? Hospice care is for a terminally ill person who's expected to have 6 months or less to live. But hospice care can be provided for as long as the person's doctor and hospice care team certify that the condition remains life-limiting. Many people who receive hospice care have cancer, while others have heart disease, dementia, kidney failure, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. An example people who are in charge of hospice care are the doctors, the pharmacies, and other professionals. Doctors, they are the person who knows the best for the patient, and they are the person who knows multiple medication like surgeries. Pharmacists. Pharmacists provide medication, oversight, and suggestions regarding the most effective ways to relieve symptoms. And other professionals, speech, physical, and occupational therapists can provide therapy if needed. The next type of care is the palliative care. Palliative care is helping individuals die with dignity, supportive, and comfort care. The goal of palliative care is to help people with serious illnesses feel better. It prevents or treats symptoms and side effects of disease and treatment. Palliative care also treats emotional, social, practical, and spiritual problems that illnesses can bring up. When the person feels better in these areas, they have an improved quality of life. And examples of people who are in charge in palliative care are nurses, caregivers, psychiatrists, and also you. You can be one of them. Palliative care may be offered for people with illnesses such as cancer, heart disease, lung diseases, kidney failure, dementia, HIV or AIDS, and ALS or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. While receiving palliative care, people can remain under the care of their regular healthcare provider and still receive treatment for their disease. I am Lovely Manuel.
And I am C. N. Marie T. Hernandez, bringing you the details about defining that and decisions regarding life, that, and healthcare.
Live online are Demi Bantapulo and Remy Madalozo. Remy and Demi, what is the death system and its cultural context?
The death system. The death system is a concept introduced by Robert Kostenbaum in 1977. It is defined as the interpersonal, socio-cultural, and symbolic network through which an individual's relationship to mortality is mediated by his or her society. To Kostenbaum, the death system in any given society has a number of components, 5 specifically. First we have is people. We people have a role in a death system. We will encounter death someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe next year, maybe today. We won't ever escape death because death is inevitable, which means unavoidable or certain to happen. The second one is place. This means a space where people die and experience dying. This includes hospitals, funeral homes, morgues, cemeteries, battlefields, memorials, or even the bedroom. The third component is time. Certain holidays like Halloween or Galagalag or All Saints' Day or Good Friday among Christian traditions, the anniversary of a death, battle, or disaster are associated with a time. A time to reflect upon or remember the dead. This is Demirot Bantaculo speaking, and my partner Remy will give more ideas.
Thank you, Demi. Today I explain to you what is object and symbol that is connected to death. We all know many objects in the culture are associated with death. The best example of this is the casket and clothes, armbands and hearses in specific color, while the skull and crossbone, as well as the last rites in the Catholic religion and various religious ceremonies that are connected to death is part of the symbol. Always remember, if it's a thing, it is part of the object. If it is a sign or ceremonies, it is part of symbols. That's all for the death system. Back to you, Eman.
Now that we've heard about defining death, the death system, and its cultural context, let us dive in deeper to the developmental perspective on death. Al-Farabi and Asiya will introduce us to the topic.
Thank you, Mr. Emmanuel. Yes, I'm Al-Farabi K. Sandab. My report is all about developmental perspective on death. So, causes of death vary across the human lifespan. The human lifespan start from prenatal, childhood, adolescent, middle age, and older, adulthood. So, the causes of death of prenatal, according to the World Health Organization, it is the death of a baby between 22 weeks of gestation and 7 days after birth. So on 2017, according to their survey, almost 2.6 million victims of prenatal death.
Prenatal death due miscarriage.
Second is human lifespan is childhood under 1 to 2 to 12 to 13 year old. So, in childhood, the common causes of death is accident or illness caused most childhood death. Third human lifespan is what we call adolescent in young adult under the age of 18 to 25. So the causes of death of adolescent and young adult is result from suicide, homicide, or motor vehicle accident. Last is the middle age and older adulthood, where the middle age is under 36 to 55-year-old and older adulthood is under 56-year-old and above. So the common causes of death of this stage is usually result from chronic diseases. That's all, and The next report is about attitude toward death at different points in the lifespan by Miss Asti Alto.
Yes, Alfred, here are the 4 different points in lifespan and their attitude towards death. First is infant and preschool children. Infants have no understanding about the concept of death, while preschool children understood death as a temporary and irreversible. There is no concept of a personal death. Death for them is something that only happens to other people. They can begin to use the word death and develop an awareness that this is different to being alive. The second one is elementary school years children. They have a clearer understanding about death and it is developing. There is an increased interest in the physical and biological aspect of death. With elementary children, the child's concept of death is very similar to an adolescent's. Death is not reversible or temporary but only happens to some or other people. Death is often thought of as a person or a ghost figure. Most psychologists argue that honesty is the best strategy for helping children to cope up with death. The third one is adolescence. Adolescents have more abstract philosophical views of death than children do. Lastly, the middle adulthood is a time when adults show a heightened consciousness about death and death anxiety. Older adults often show less death anxiety than middle-aged adults, but older adults experience and converse about death more. Attitudes about death may vary considerably among adults of my age. That is all for developmental perspective of death. I am Astia M. Ontok reporting. Eman?
Stretch your arms and your body. Take a sip of your milk, tea, or coffee. Let's keep the conversation going after this 3-minute break.
Kung tayo ay matanda na, sana'y di tayo magbago.
Wish 1075.
Kailanman, nasan may ikaw ang pangarap ko. Makuha mo pa kaya ako'y hakan at yakapin. Hanggang sa pagtanda natin. Nagtatanong lang sa'yo, ako ba kaya'y ibigin mo? Kahit maputi na ang buhok ko. Pagdating ng araw, ang iyong buhok ay puputi na rin. O sabay tayong mangangarap ng nakaraan natin. Ang nakalipas ay iba, balik natin. Oh, papaalala ko sa'yo ang aking pangako, ang pag-ibig ko'y lagi sa'yo. Kahit maputi na ang buhok ko. La 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 la. La 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 la. La 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 la. Ang nakalipas ay ibabalik natin. Papaalala ko sa'yo, oh, ang aking pangako, ang pag-ibig ko'y lagi sa'yo. Oh, kahit maputi, oh, kahit maputi, Kahit maputi na ang buhok ko.
Wishclusive on Wish 1075.
And we are back. For facing one's own death, we have Josemy Behok and Hojaima Ante.
Five Stages of Dying by Kubler-Ross. The first stage is the denial and isolation. This is the first stage of dying, when person denies that death is really going to take place. It is commonly a diagnosis of terminal illness. For example, a person is diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer and the doctor said that he or she has only a month or two to live. That person already knows the truth that his life will end soon, but he could not accept it. The second stage is the anger, which the dying person recognizes that the denial is no longer maintained. In this stage of dying, the person becomes increasingly difficult to care. In this stage, the dying person thinks that he is unworthy, and the people around him does not love him nor care for him because of his illness. Bargaining. It is a third stage of dying. In this stage, the person develops the hope that death is somehow postponed. Some people do rituals because they believe that death can be negotiable nor can bargain. The fourth stage is depression. It is the fourth stage of dying which the dying person comes to accept that the certainty of death. In this stage, the dying person spends much time in grieving. The dying person develops an intense sadness and anxious. The dying person thinks that the dying is the most painful thing that happened to him and to the people he will left. And the fifth stage is the acceptance. It is the last stage of dying. In this stage, the dying person develops a sense of peace, accept his or her fate, also feeling and the physical pain are no longer absent.
Thank you, Hujaima. So now, let's tackle about perceived control and denial. So, perceived control is believing that they can influence and control the events, while denial is a coping mechanism that a person might be afraid of pain or losing control of their bodily functions or mind. In perceived control, it may work as an adaptive strategy to adults who face death. It increases their longevity, they will control and improve their attitudes. They believe that they can change the event, such as prolonging their lives. They become more alert and cheerful. We are all susceptible in attempting to deny reality. Why we attempt to do that? Why it is so uncomfortable? And why reality we're not willing to experience reality? Have you ever thought about that? Because all of us use the denial to shift what is really happening in the moment, because for whatever reason we don't want to experience it, and we use it because life can be uncomfortable, and so that we try to control what life is presenting. So that's how denial and control work together. So denial comes first because we feel uncomfortable, and the second we feel uncomfortable, we are going to alter it. That's we start to use the mechanism of control. Why we control? Control means to hide, conceal, or cover up uncomfortable emotions and thoughts that others experiencing as a result of living life. So the person will use the control and denial strategies to cover up the uncomfortableness that they feel because they're dying. But our responsibility actually is to allow life to come towards us and experience exactly what life is. We'll use controlling strategies, and there are lots of different form of strategies. They will try to change the discomfort that they feel so that it would not be so bad. But nothing in this world that is coincidental. It's all scheduled. It's all set up to give each of us an opportunity to learn or experience particularly what life is. The context in which people die is they would rather die at home to avoid burden of the family member. They worry about medical care at home and they think about financial problem like medicines and other materials that they will be needed. And this is Josemie GB Hawk speaking. Back to you, Eman.
Thank you, Hojaima and Josemie. Now, for coping with the death of someone, let's take it from Melvin Perocho and Fido Stankley.
I am Melvin U. Perocho for coping with death of someone. Loss can come in many forms in our lives. Divorce, a pet's death, being fired from a job, but no loss is greater than from which comes through the death of someone we love and care. For such as a parent, sibling, spouse, relative, or friend. In the ratings of life stresses that require the most adjustment, death of a spouse is given the highest number. Coping with death of someone, there are 6 subtopics. Communicating with a dying person, grieving, coping and type of death, making sense of the world, losing a life partner, and forms of mourning. For communicating with a dying person, most psychologists argue that it is the best for a dying individuals to know that they are dying and for the significant others to know that they are dying so that they can interact and communicate with each other on the basis of this mutual understanding. What are the some advantages of this open awareness for a dying individual? First, dying individuals can close their lives in accord with their own ideas about proper dying. Second, they are able to complete some plans and projects so they make arrangement for survivors and to participate in the decision about a funeral and burial. Third, dying individuals can have the opportunity to reminiscence, to the converse with the people who have been important to them. And fourth, individuals who know they are dying have more understanding of what is happening with their bodies and what is medical stuff for doing for them. For grieving, grief is an emotional numbness, disbelief, separation anxiety, despair, sadness, and loneliness that accompany the loss of someone we love. Grief is not a simple emotional state, but rather a complex, evolving a process with multiple dimensions. Prolonged grief disorder, grief that involves enduring despair and remains unresolved over the extended period of time. The dual process model of coping with bereavement has 2 dimensions. First, the loss-oriented stressors. Second, the restoration-oriented stressors. Loss-oriented stressors, as DPM defines them, are the stressors that come from focusing on the processing the loss of the person who has died and our relationship with that person. Loss-oriented stressors are thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that bring up memories to their loss. Examples of loss-oriented stressors are thinking about a particular memory with your loved who passed away, cooking your loved one's favorite meal, and thinking about the last time you were together. The restoration-oriented stressors are things that let you get on the daily life and distract you from the grief for a while. Some people cope with grief by taking on the high tough work assignment or by tending to do everyday chores in order to give themselves something on the other pain to focus on. How can you tell if a child is grieving? First, He or she has a difficulty on concentrating, sleeping problems, clinginess, anxiety, or feeling abandoned. Developmental regression, changes in behavior or play, feelings of guilt. This is Melvin U. Perocho speaking. Let's take the topic further with Fairud Stankley.
I will be reporting about coping with death of someone. We will be going to know the coping and types of death, making sense of the world, losing a life partner, and forms of mourning. Let us start with coping and type of death. Impact of death is strongly influenced by circumstances under which death occurs. Sudden, untimely, violent, or traumatic deaths are likely to have more intense and prolonged effects. Diverse grieving patterns are culturally embedded practices. Coping with the death or loss of a loved one may be a challenging and emotional experience. Because loss is so painful and emotional, some individuals may try to hide or reject it in order to protect themselves from difficult emotions and feelings that come with it. Avoiding the grieving process can make it difficult for a person to process death or loss in a healthy way, as well as prolong or stop the grieving process. Addressing and processing a loss, however difficult, can help them diminish sadness over time. Grieving can help people commemorate a loved one's memories while also allowing them to feel happy and connected again. There are 4 types of death, including natural death, homicide, suicide death, accidental death. Natural death is typically the end result of a disease or an internal malfunction due to old age. Homicide, this type of death often requires a volitional act or might result from negligent, reckless, or accidental activities. Suicide death is basically the act of causing one's own death unintentionally. Accidental death, this type of death can be still considered as suicide or homicide if the human is an intentional cause. Let's proceed with making sense of the world. One beneficial aspect of grieving is that it stimulates many individuals to try to make sense of the world. When death is caused by an accident or disaster, the effort to make sense of it is pursued vigorously. Grieving isn't the same as forgetting. It's also not a matter of drowning in tears. Your loss is significant, so it is reasonable that you'll be sad when you remember your loved ones. Healthy grieving results in the ability to remember the significance of our loss, but with a renewed sense of calm rather than searing pain. Hiding our feelings or holding back our tears can sap our energy, which is something we can't afford to lose during the grieving process. In losing a life partner, those left behind by an intimate partner often prefer to suffer profound grief and often endure financial loss, loneliness, increased physical illness, and psychological disorder. Some people's feelings of loss are debilitating and do not improve with time. Complicated grieving, often known as persistent complex bereavement disorder, is a term used to describe this. In complicated grieving, painful emotions stay so long and are so intense that it's difficult to heal from the loss and resuming your own life. We generally think of grieving as only an emotional experience. However, it can also lead to physical problems such as fatigue, nausea, insomnia, lowered immunity, weight loss or weight gain, aches, and pains. Many widowers increase religious and spiritual beliefs following the loss of a spouse. Studies have revealed that some people turn to God as a coping technique during times of significant life stress. Widowed older individuals reported higher levels of religious and spiritual beliefs over time than non-widowed older adults, and this rise was connected to lower levels of experienced sadness. Individuals who had more secured God attachment showed a reduce of levels of depression and grief, as well as stronger stress-related growth when they were bereaved. Bereaved are at higher risk of health problems. Higher anxiety was linked to a larger sense of loss of control, decreased energy, increased suicide ideation, increased risk of heart attack, increased risk of stomach problem, poorer health, and more difficulty sleeping among bereaved people. Social supports help them adjust to the death of a spouse. One of the most distressing events in a person's life is the death of a spouse. Social support has been found to be effective in reducing the negative consequences of chronic and acute stress. According to Kant's theory of social support, widows and widowers receive the most social support from their own family. They found the received support to be the most useful, but they also value the support that the mourning person can provide to the other family members. Forms of mourning. One decision is to decide what to do with the body, whether it is burial or cremation. Funeral services is more meaningful to religious survivors. Family and community have important roles. Each culture, religion, and spiritual group has its own set of funeral rites and traditions that prescribe how to honor and respect the deceased, as well as how to help those left behind cope with grief. These rituals might vary greatly between groups. Individuals' preferences have a role in funerals as well. Some people prefer to be cremated, despite the fact that many organized religions follow a proper funeral and burial. Others find it beneficial to develop their own particular rituals and traditions. Traditional rituals may provide comfort to some mourners, but they may leave others feeling hollow. That's it for my live report. This is Firoods. Back to the studio.
You have just heard the latest news around the globe. Again, this is Eman Coronado, your anchor for today. News with no bias, news with no exception, delivering nothing but the truth. This is Developmental Psychology Center, the source of human lifespan education. Thank you for being with us.